Hey everybody, Nate here, jumping in before the show to say that we've been having a lot of fun answering your listener questions. So far we've covered things like Pascal's wager, the hot hand fallacy, or the fallacy of the hot hand fallacy actually, and the expected value of learning new languages. And we want to keep doing this kind of thing, so send in all your questions about risk, decision making, game theory, poker, anything but your fantasy football team. We're tired of talking about that. Sorry. Reach out to us on social media or email at riskybusiness@pushkin.fm. Even if you're not a premium subscriber, this is a great way to support the show so we can keep sharing it free of charge. We look forward to hearing from you.
Welcome back to Risky Business, a show about making better decisions. I'm Maria Konnikova.
And I'm Nate Silver.
Nate, today on the show is going to be a little bit doomtastic.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it's like worse than thinking about like the global economy going into a recession because of dumb fuck tariff policies. Did I use that term? Whatever. We have the explicit label on the show for a reason sometimes, right? This is all about how we're all going to die in 7 years instead.
We'll be talking about a report that came out called AI 2027 from the AI Futures Project. What they said, what it means, and how our thinking about AI and PDoom has evolved as a result.
Yeah, the contrast is interesting between like all the chaos we're seeing with tariff policy potentially spilling over into the economy, right? In terms of starting a trade war with China and then other types of chaos. Trump is certainly on the verge of defying a court order with respect to, I believe the name is Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who was the immigrant from El Salvador, who the Supreme Court wants returned. So it's interesting to kind of look at this. I wouldn't call it a more optimistic future exactly, but like on a different trajectory of like a future that's going to change very fast, according to these authors, with profound implications for, everything. Even though there is some hedging here, this is kind of their base case scenario, and base case number one and base case number two differ. There's like kind of a choose your own adventure at some point in this report, but they're both very different than the status quo, right? And the notion
Absolutely.
that we hear from AI researchers is that like you're not just going to have the Jetsons, I've heard people say, right? Where it's like, okay, things are the same except we have flying cars and computer robots in our homes and everything like that, right? That everything becomes different if AIs become substantially more intelligent than human beings. People can debate, and we will debate on this program kind of what that means. But yeah, do you want to contextualize this? Do you want to talk about kind of who the authors are of this report?
Absolutely. So the report is authored by, officially by 5 people, but I think unofficially there's also a 6th. We've got Eli Leifeland, who's a super forecaster, and he was ranked first on Rand's forecasting initiative. So he is someone who is very good at kind of looking at the future, trying to predict what's going to happen. You have Jonas Vollmer, who's a VC at Macroscopic Ventures. Thomas Larson was a former executive director of the Center for AI Policy. So that is a center that advises both sides of the aisle on, how AI is going to go. And Romeo Dean, who is part of Harvard's AI safety student team. So someone who is kind of the next generation of people looking at AI. And finally, we have Daniel Cocktailo, who basically had written a report back in 2021. He was a AI researcher, and he looked at predictions for AI for 2026, and it turns out that his predictions were pretty spot on.
There's also Scott Alexander.
Exactly. So I was saying he's the person who kind of is in the background, and he's you guys might know him as the author behind Astral Codex.
And I know Scott. He's kind of one of the fathers of what you might call rationalism. Mm-hmm. I think Scott, when I interviewed him for my book, was happy enough with that term and accused me or co-opted me into also being a rationalist. These people are somewhat adjacent to the effective altruist, but not quite, right? Mm-hmm. They're just trying to apply a sort of thoughtful, rigorous, quantitative lens to big picture problems, including existential risk, of which most people in this community believe that AI is both an existential risk and also kind of an existential opportunity, right? That it could transform things. You talk to Sam Altman, he'll say, we're going to cure cancer and eliminate poverty and whatever else, right? And Scott's also an excellent writer. And so let me disclose something which is slightly important here. So I actually was approached by some of the authors of this report a couple of months ago. I guess it was in February-ish. Just to give feedback and chat with them. So I'm working off the draft version, right? Which I do not believe they changed very much.
So I was not on the inside loop, so I did not get an earlier draft. And I've read this draft. And basically, just to kind of big picture sum it up, it outlines two scenarios, right? Two major scenarios for how AI might change the world as soon as 2030. Now, important note, like that date is kind of hedged. It might be sooner. It might be later. There's kind of there's a confidence interval there. But, the two different scenarios, one basically, let's just like cut to the chase. Doom 2030, humanity disappears and is taken over by AI. The positive report is in 2030, basically we get AIs that are aligned to our interests, and we get kind of this AI utopia where AIs actually help make life much better for everyone and make the standard of living much higher. But the crucial turning point is before 2030. And the crucial kind of question at the center of this is, will we be able to design AIs that are truly aligned to human interests rather than just appear to be aligned and kind of lying to us while actually following their own agenda? And how we handle that is kind of the linchpin. And it's actually interesting, Nate, that you started out with China, because a lot of the policy choices and a lot of what they see as kind of the decision points that will affect the future of humanity actually hinge on the US-China dynamic, how kind of they compete with each other and how that sometimes might basically clash against safety concerns because no one wants to be left behind. Can we manage that effectively? And can kind of that transition work in our favor as opposed to against us? I think that this is kind of one of the big questions here. And so it's funny that we're seeing all of this trade war right now as this report is coming out.
Yeah, look, I mean, look, I think this exercise is partly just a forecasting exercise, right? I mean, obviously there's this kind of like fork at the bottom where we learn to have an AI slowdown, or we kind of are pressing fully on the accelerator, right? Like in some ways, scenarios are like not that different, right? Either one assumes remarkable rates of technological growth that I think even AI, I'm never quite sure who to call an optimist or a pessimist, right? Even AI believers, might think is a little bit aggressive, right? But what they want to do is they want to have like a specific fleshed out scenario for how the world would look like. It's kind of like a modal scenario. And like, I think they'd say that like, we're not totally sure about either of these necessarily, right? And I don't think they'd be as like pedantic as to say, if you do X, Y, and Z, then we'll save the world and have utopia. And if you don't, then we'll all die, right? I think they probably say it's unclear and there's kind of like risk either way. And we wanted to go through the scenario of like fleshing out like kind of like what the world might look like, right? I do think one thing that's important is that whatever decisions are made now could get locked in, right? That you pass certain points of no return. And it becomes very hard to decelerate like an arms race. This is, what we found during the Cold War, for example. I mean, one of the big things they look at is like, do we force the AI to be transparent in its thinking with humans, right? Like now there's been a movement toward the AI will actually explicate its thinking more. I'll ask it a query, OpenAI. The Chinese models do this too, right? And they'll say, I am thinking about X, Y, and Z, and I'm looking up PD and Q, and now I'm reconsidering this. It actually has this chain of thought process, right? Which is explicated in English. One concern is that what if the AI just kind of communicates to one another in these implicit vectors that that's inferring from all the text it has. It's kind of unintelligible to human beings, right? It may be kind of quote unquote thinking in that way in the first place, and then does us the favor of like translating back. So it goes from English to kind of this big bag of numbers, as one AI researcher called it, right? And then it translates it back into English or whatever language you want, really, in the end. What if it just cuts out that last step, right? Then we can't kind of like check what AI is doing. Then it can behave deceptively more easily. So, so that part seems to be important. But I know, yeah, I've been talking, Maria. What was I want to hear your first impressions before I kind of poison the well too much.
Well, my first impressions is that the alignment problem is a very real one and an incredibly important one to solve. And what I got from this is that actually the problem that I've had with like these initial AI LLMs is the kernel of what they're seeing there, right? So you and I have kind of talked about this on the show in the past, and I've said, well, my problem is that when I'm a domain expert, right, I start seeing some inaccuracies and I start seeing like places where like it either just didn't do well or made shit up or whatever it is. Now, I think it's very clear that those problems are going to go away, right? That it's actually, that is going to get much, much better. However, the kind of the kernel of it's showing me something, but that might just be, I have no way of verifying if that's kind of what's going on, what it's reading, like how it's, I don't want to say thinking about it, even though in the report they do use thinking, but it's, I hate anthropomorphizing too much.
I think thinking is correct.
Okay. So we'll stick to that language.
Okay.
Yeah. So how it's thinking about it, that those little problems and like the glitches and the things that it might be doing where it starts actually glitching on purpose are not going to be visible to the human eye. And so one of the main things that they say here is that as AI internal R&D gets rapidly faster. So that means basically AIs researching AIs, right? And so internally they start developing new models. And as they kind of surpass human ability to monitor it, it becomes progressively more difficult to figure out, okay, is the AI actually doing what I want it to do? Is the output that it's giving me its actual thought process? And is it accurate, or is it like trying to deceive me, but it's actually kind of inserting certain things on purpose because it has different goals, right? Because it is actually secretly misaligned, but it's very good at persuading me that it's aligned. Because one of the things that actually came out of this report, and I was like, this is interesting, is if we get kind of this remarkable improvement in AI, it will also remarkably improve at persuading us, right? And at
this is one part I don't buy.
Yeah. So this is, but I'd never even thought about that. I was like, okay, fine. But, one of the things that I do buy is that, our expertise is going to, it's going to be very difficult for us to monitor it and to figure out, like, is it truly aligned with human, with human wants, with human kind of desires, with human goals. And the experts who are capable of doing that, I think, are actually going to dwindle, right? As AI starts kind of proliferating in society, we're already seeing this in some college classes. There are so many professors who are complaining that, their coding students are actually unable to kind of complete the most basic things without AI help because they've been using it so often. Like the experts who are able to actually be the human side of this are going to dwindle. They're going to, right? There's going to be a limited supply as the new generation actually thinks about this differently and lacks the skills to do that. And so to me, that is something that is actually quite worrisome. And that is something that we really need to be paying attention to, because otherwise, how do we actually make sure that we are building tools that are giving us good data? Now, just to fast forward a little bit, in their doomsday scenario in 2030, when, AI takes over, it basically suddenly, releases some chemical agents, right? And humanity dies and the rest of the stragglers are taken care of by drones, et cetera. I don't even it doesn't
It's a quick and painless death. I would say.
Let's hope. We don't know what the chemical agents are. It might not be quick and painless. Some chemical agents are actually a very painful death, Nate. So let's hope it's quick and painless. If they're actually capable of deception at that high level, then you technically don't even need them to do it. If we're trusting medicine and all sorts of things to the AIs, it's pretty easy for it to actually manipulate something and, and actually insert something into codes, etc., that will fuck up humanity in a way that we can't actually figure out at the moment, right? Like, think of it the way I think of it, and this is not from the paper, but this is just the way that like my mind processed it, is like, think about DNA, right? Like, you have these remarkably complex, huge strands of data. And as we've found out, but it's taken, forever, one tiny mutation can actually be fatal, right? But it takes you can't spot that mutation. Sometimes that mutation isn't fatal immediately, but will only manifest at a certain point in time. And so that's the way that my mind tried to conceptualize what this actually means. And so I think that that would be easy for a deceptive AI to do. And to me, like that's kind of the big takeaway from this report, is that we need to make sure that we are building AIs that will not deceive, right? That their capabilities, they explain them in an honest way, and that honesty and trust is actually prioritized over other things, even though it might slow down research, it might slow down other things, but that kind of alignment step is absolutely crucial at the beginning, because otherwise humans are human, right? They're easily manipulated. And we often trust that computers are quote unquote rational because they're computers, but they're not, right? They have their own inputs. They have their own weights. They have their own values. And that could just lead us down a dark path.
So let me follow up with this pushback, I guess, right? Like, first of all, I don't know that humans are so easily persuaded. This is my big critique with like all the misinformation people who say, well, misinformation is the biggest problem that society faces. It's like, people are actually pretty stubborn, and they're kind of, just sound pretentious, they're kind of Bayesian in how they formulate their beliefs, right? They have some notion of reality. They're looking at the credibility of the person who is telling them these remarks. If it's an unpersuasive source, it might make them less likely to believe. They're balancing with other information, with their lived experience, so-called, right? Part of the reason that like I am skeptical of AIs being super persuasive is like, that it's an AI, and it's trying to persuade you. You know what I mean? So like, if you go and play poker against like a really chatty player, Phil Hellmuth or Scott Siever or someone like that, right? On some level that the best play is just to totally ignore it, right? That they are trying to sweet talk you into doing exactly what they want you to do. And so the best play is to disengage, or literally you can randomize your moves if you have some notion of what the game theoretical optimal play might be, right? Or salesmen or politicians have reputations for being, he's a little too smooth. Gavin Newsom, little too fucking smooth, right? I don't know if I'm Gavin Newsom persuasive at all, right? He's a little too, from the hair gel to the constantly shifting vibes. I mean, I don't really find Gavin Newsom persuasive at all, even though like an AI, I might say, boy, Gavin Newsom's a good looking guy. He's a little gravelly throated, but whatever. I think, look, the big critique I have of this project, and by the way, I think this is an amazing project, in addition to like wonderful writing, these very cool graphics. If you view it on the web, not your phone, so these very cool like little infographic that updates everything from like the market value of, they don't call it OpenAI, they call it Open Brain, I guess is what they settle on.
Yeah, they call everything something else just to make sure that they're not stepping on any toes. So they have Open Brain, and then they have Deep Scent from China.
I wonder which one that could be. I wonder. But it's beautifully presented and written, and like I appreciate they're going out on a limb here. I think they have. It's been fairly well received. I've gotten some pushback both from inside and I think outside the AI safety community, right? But they're putting their necks on the line here. They will look if things look pretty normal, if the world looks pretty normal in 2032 or whatever, right? Then they will look dumb for having published.
Well, and they actually have that, right, as a scenario that you end up looking stupid if everything goes well, but that's okay.
Yeah.
Now, I do want to push back. Can I push back on the persuasion thing a little bit? Just on two things. So first of all, the poker example is not actually a particularly, I think, applicable one here, because you know that you're playing poker and you know that someone is trying to get information and deceive you. The tricky thing, so this is kind of when I spent time with con artists, the best con artists aren't Gavin Newsom. Like, they're not car salesmen. You have no idea they're trying to persuade you to do something. They are just like nice, affable people who are incredibly charismatic. And even in the poker community, by the way, like some of the biggest grifters who, like, it comes out later on, we're just like stealing money and doing all of these things, are charming, right? They're not sleazy looking. They're not like, they have no signs of, oh, I'm a salesman, I'm trying to sell you something. The people who are actually good at persuasion, you do not realize you're being persuaded. And I think people are incredibly easy to kind of subtly lead in a certain direction if you know how to do it. And I think AIs could do that. And they might persuade you when you don't even think they're trying to persuade you. You might just ask, like, can you please summarize this research report? And the way that it frames it, right, the way that it summarizes it just subtly changes the way that you think of this issue. We see that in psych studies all the time, by the way, where you have different articles presented in slightly different orders, slightly different ways, and people from the same political beliefs, same starting point, come away with different impressions of what kind of the right course of action is, or what this is actually trying to tell you, because the way the information is presented actually influences how you think about it. It's very, very easy to do subtle manipulations like that. And if we're relying on AI on a large scale for a lot of our lives, I think that if it has like a quote unquote master plan, the way that they present in this report, then persuasion in that sense is actually going to be pretty simple.
But you'll know you're being manipulated, right?
No, you don't. Issue. No, that's the thing. You don't know you're being manipulated. But
people will adjust and adapt because it's AI, and that will.
I don't know. I honestly, like, Nate, I applaud your belief in humans' ability to adjust to this, but I don't know that they will, because I've just seen enough people who are incredibly intelligent fall for cons and then, be very unpersuadable that they have been conned, right? Instead, doubling down and saying, no, I have not. So humans are stubborn, but they're also stubborn in saying, I have not been deceived. I have not been manipulated, when in fact they have, to protect their ego and to protect their view of themselves as people who are not capable of being manipulated or deceived. And I think that that is incredibly powerful. And I think that that's going to push against your optimism. I hope you're right. But from what I know, I don't think you are.
I'm not quite sure I call it optimism. So I guess maybe we do have like slightly different views of human nature, but like there's not yet a substantial market for like AI driven art or writing. And I'm sure there will be one eventually, right? But like people understand that like as people, that context matters, right? That you could have AI create a ripoff of the Mona Lisa, but you can also buy ripoff of the Mona Lisa on Canal Street for $5, right? And like, so it's the intentionality of the act and the context of the speaker. Now I sound like super woke, I guess, right? But like where you're coming from and what your lived experience. I think that actually is how humans communicate. Like art that might be pointless drivel coming from somebody can be something different coming from a Jackson Pollock.
Absolutely.
Or whatever, and so like I just okay.
I think that's a really important point, by the way. I think it's a different point, but I think that is a very important point. I think context does matter.
I was buttering up this report before. My big critique of it is like, where are the human beings in this? Or put another way, kind of like, where is the politics, right? They're trying not to use any remotely controversial real names, right? So you have Open Brain, for example. So where is President Trump? Let me just do a quick Google search to make sure the name Trump.
So they do actually, I don't know if this existed, maybe they took your criticism in this, but they do have like the vice president and the president. Like they do put politicians in this version of the report. They don't have names, but they say the vice president in one of these scenarios, handily wins the election of 2028. We have one vice president.
Do they have general secretary, I think. I'm not sure.
General secretary.
The general secretary resembles Xi.
Yep.
And the vice president kind of resembles J.D. Vance, right? I don't think the president resembles Trump at all, right? It's kind of this composite character.
Yeah, they tried to sidestep that as much as possible.
But if we think this is all happening in the next 4 years, then, presidential politics matter quite a bit. I mean, I don't know. This is such a fucking, I was jogging earlier on the east side and I was listening to the Ezra Klein interview with Thomas Friedman. It's such a fucking yuppie fucking thing, right?
It's okay. It's okay. You're allowed to be a yuppie, Nate. Sometimes you just
Friedman,
gotta embrace
I'm not a huge fan of necessarily, but is well versed on geopolitics and China issues. He's like, yeah, China. He's just been back from China. He's like, yeah, China's kind of winning. You know what I mean? And I'm not sure how Trump's hawkishness on China, but kind of imbecilically executed hawkishness on China. I'm not sure kind of how that figures in to this, right? If we're reducing U.S.-China trade, that probably does produce an AI slowdown, maybe more for us if they're not exporting their raw earth materials and so forth, but we're making it harder for them to get NVIDIA chips, so they probably have lots of workarounds and things like that. Maybe Trump's tariffs are good. I'd like to ask the authors of this report because it means that we're going to have slower AI progress. I'm not joking, right?
On the
other hand, it increases the hostility between the U.S. and China in the long run, right? I mean, that's the thing. If we rescinded all the tariffs tomorrow, I think we've still permanently, or let's not say permanent, let's say at least for a decade or so, have injured U.S. standing in the world. And so I don't know how that figures in, but and I'm also not sure kind of quote what the rational response might be. But one thing they track, let me make sure that they kept this into their report, right? So they actually have their implied approval rating for how people feel about Open Brain, which is their
it's very negative
proxy for OpenAI. Right? I think this actually is some feedback that they took into account, right? They originally had it slightly less negative, but they have this being persistently negative and then getting more negative over time. It was a little softer in the previous version that I saw, so they did change that one thing on at some stage. But the fact that AI scares people, it scares people for both good and bad reasons, but I think mostly for valid reasons, right? That the fear is fairly bipartisan, that the biggest AI accelerators are now these kind of Republican techno-optimists who are not looking particularly wise given how it's going with the first 90 days, whatever we are, of the Trump administration. And the likelihood of a substantial political backlash, right? Which could lead to dumb types of regulations. But part of it too is okay, AI, they're saying, can do, not just anymore, by the way, computer desk jobs, but all types of things, right? And humans kind of play this role initially as supervisors, and then literally within a couple of years, people start to say, am I really adding much value here, right? And you kind of have, what's the term, sinecure? Am I using that term? But you kind of have these legacy jobs, and there is a lot of money. I think most of these scenarios imagine very fast economic growth, although maybe very lumpy, right? For some parts of the world and not others. But we're kind of just, sitting around with a lot of idle time. It might be good for live poker, Maria, right? All of a sudden, all these smart people, their Open Earth or Open Brain, stock is now worth billions of dollars, right? And really nothing to do because the AI is doing all their work, right? They have a lot of fucking time to play some fucking Texas Hold'em, right?
That is one way of thinking about it. Let's go back to your earlier point, which I actually think is an important one, because obviously they were trying to do, as all super forecasting tries to do, is you try to create a report that will work in multiple scenarios, right? You can't tie it too much to like the present moment. Otherwise your forecasts, are going to be quite biased. However, I do think that what you raise, kind of our current situation with China, et cetera, has very real implications given that this is kind of the central dynamic of this report that their predictions are based on. I think that it's incredibly valid to actually speculate, how will, if at all, this affect the timeline of the predictions, the likelihood of the two scenarios, one very good scenario, one very bad scenario, the likelihood that they're happening. And I will also say that one of the things in the report is that all of these negotiations on like, will we slow down? Will we not? How aligned is it? This all takes place in secret, right? Like we don't know, humans don't know that it's going on. We don't know what's happening behind the scenes, and we don't know what the decision makers are kind of thinking. And so for all we know, President Trump is meeting with Sam Altman and trying to kind of do some of these things. And that is kind of, it's funny because we're kind of pushing for transparency in one way, but there's a lot of things here that are very much not transparent.
Yeah, it's kind of the deep state, right? But also a lot of the negotiations are now AI versus AI, right?
Yep.
One of the reasons...
And will become even more so.
Yeah. And look, I think that AIs, first of all, again, I'm not sure I buy that. I'm not sure that AIs will have that trust both with the external actor and internally. I'm skeptical of that, right? If that does happen, they kind of think this might be good because the AIs will probably behave in like a literally game theory optimal way, right? And understand these things and make, I guess, like fewer mistakes than humans
if they're properly
might.
aligned. Like that's a crucial thing, because in the doomsday scenario, AI negotiates with AI, but they conspire to destroy humanity, right? So there are two scenarios. One, it's actually properly aligned, so AI negotiates with AI, game theory works out, and we end up with democracy and wonderful things. But in the other one, where they're misaligned, AI negotiates with AI to create a new AI basically and destroy humanity. So it can go one way or the other depending on that alignment step, first of all.
I mean, the utopia didn't seem that utopian to me, right?
No, it didn't. It actually seemed quite dystopian to me.
Yeah.
It seemed incredibly dystopian.
That's kind of like
but at least we're still alive, right? That one.
And we'll have cures. We'll probably live longer. And again, lots of poker. The AI will be writing Silver Bulletin and hosting our podcast, right? Let me back up a little bit, because like I think we maybe take for granted that some of these premises are kind of controversial, right? So they have a breakpoint, I think, in 2026. Well, it says why uncertainty increases substantially beyond 2026, right? So that's kind of the breakpoint. Is like 27 is this inflection point. I think I'm using that term correctly in this context. So I'm reading this report, and up to 2026, I'm like, thumbs up, yeah. This seems like very smart and detailed about like, how the economy is reacting and how politics are reacting in the race dynamic with China. Maybe there needs to be a little bit more Trump in there. I understand why politically they didn't want to get into that mess, right? But like, so there's kind of three different things here, right? One is a notion of what's sometimes called AGI, or artificial general intelligence. And if you asked 100 different researchers, you get 100 different definitions of what AGI is. But, I think it is basically like being able to do a large majority of things that a human being could do competently, assuming, this is the thing that they don't tell you, right? Assuming we're limiting it to kind of like desk job type tasks, right? Anything that can be done remotely is sometimes the definition that is used, or through remote work, right? Because clearly AIs are inferior to humans in like sorting and folding laundry or things like that, right? That require a certain type of intelligence, right? If you use the kind of desk job definition, then like AI is already pretty close to AGI, right? I use large language models all the freaking time, and they're not perfect for everything. But like, in terms of like being able to do the large majority of desk work at levels ranging from competent intern to super genius, like on average, it's probably pretty close to being generally intelligent by that definition, right?
If you're the
now.
one using it, I just want to once again point that out, because one of the things that they say in the report, as it gets more and more involved, what we're asking AI to do, the human test, the human process to evaluate whether it's accurate and whether it's, making mistakes will get longer and longer. And I think they say for every, basically one day of work, it'll take several, it's like a 2-to-1 ratio at the beginning for how long it will take humans to verify the output, right? So you think you save time by having AI do this, but if you want it to actually kind of develop correctly, then you need a team, and it takes them twice as long to verify that what the AI did is actually true and actually valid and actually aligned, et cetera, et cetera. Now, you're not asking it to do things that require that amount of time, but I just want to caveat that there do need to be little caveats to how we think about their usefulness and how you are able to evaluate the output versus versus other scenarios.
When I use AI, the things that it's best with are things that save me time, right? Where I feed it a bunch of different names for different college basketball teams. We work in our NCAA model. I'm like, take these 7 different naming conventions. They're all different, and create a cross-reference table of these, which is kind of like a hard task, right? You need to have a little context about basketball, and it did that very well, right? That's something I could have done. It might have taken an hour or two, but instead, I could do it in a few minutes, and it gets faster. It's like, oh, I've learned from you before, Nate, so now I can be faster doing this type of task in the future. I was at the poker tournament down in Florida last week, and I asked open research, excuse me, God, is that?
See, exactly, right? It all becomes deep research. Deep research. Reading too many of these 2027 reports, your brain gets all muddled.
To pull a bunch of stock market data for me, and then I'm playing a poker hand, and I make a really thin, sexy value bet with 4th pair. No one knows what that means, right? I bet a very weak hand, because I thought the other guy would call with an even weaker hand. And I was right, and I feel like I'm such a fucking stud here, value betting 4th pair, and while AI does the work for me. And then, of course, I bust out of the tournament an hour later. And meanwhile, deep research bungles this particular task, but in general, AI has been very reliable. But the point is that there's a inflection point where I'm asking it to do things that are just a faster version of what I could do myself, or maybe actually in some instances, a more error-free version, right? It's not going to make a literal typo. Now it makes different types of mistakes, right? But
right.
So it's almost like having a good, very fast research assistant, right? I would at the moment ask AI, be like, I want you to design a new NCAA model for me with these parameters, because I wouldn't know how to test it. And you kind of use the DNA analogy before, and I'm not sure if that's perfect or not. I mean, in certain way, for some tasks, AIs are very robust, right? Because it kind of uses fuzzy soft logic, and for language, you can make a typo in an AI request, and it will still understand what you mean, for example, right? But for code, we've all written code where there's one sign inverted, a minus where there should be a plus, right? Or the brackets don't line up and whatever else, right? And when you're testing it in the real world, then, you may have a bad prediction somewhere because of a stupid mistake that the AI made, and humans make stupid mistakes too. I've definitely introduced my share of bugs. I'm sure every model that I've ever published still has some bugs. They're just not mission critical bugs because they have survived kind of the test of time, right? And when I build models, I kind of am slow about it, and you're always refining and testing, and although so I don't know, when you hear predictions oh, AI is going to do all programming in a couple of years, right? Maybe for things like website design, for a lot of things, I think it's going to be a little bit lumpier. But anyway, I'm being long-winded here. So AGI, we're going to get AGI, or at least we're going to get someone calling something AGI soon, right? Artificial superintelligence, where it's doing things much better than human beings, I think this report takes for granted, or not takes for granted, it has lots of documentation about its assumptions, but it's saying, okay, this trajectory has been very robust so far, and people make all types of bullshit predictions. So the fact that these guys in particular have made accurate predictions in the past is certainly worth something, I think, right? But they're like, okay, you kind of follow the scaling law, and before too much longer, AI starts to be more intelligent than human beings. You can debate what intelligent means if you want, but do superhuman types of things, or do them very fast, which I think might be different, right? An AI that can do things very fast is maybe it's certainly a component of intelligence, right? But I don't take for granted that quote unquote AI can reliably extrapolate beyond the data set. Mm-hmm. I just think that it's not an absurd leap of logic. It may even be the base case or close to the base case, but but it's not assumable from first principles. I don't think. We've all seen lots of trend charts of if you look at a chart of Japan's GDP in the 1980s, you might have said, okay, well, Japan's going to take over the world, and people thought this. And now its economy hasn't grown for 40 years, basically, right? And so we've all seen lots of curves that go up, and then it's actually an S curve, whatever the fuck you call it, where it begins to bend the other way at some point, and we can't tell until later, right? The other thing is the ability of AI to plan and manipulate the physical world. I mean, mm-hmm. Some of these things where they're talking about brain uploading and Dyson swarms and nanobots, I would literally wager money against this happening on the time scales that they're talking about, right? If they double the time scale, okay, then I might start to give some more probability. And look, I'm willing to be wrong about that. I guess we'll all be dead anyway, 50% likelihood in this
scenario. But in this scenario, 50% PDO.
But the physical world requires sensory input and lots of parts of our brain that AI is not as effective at manipulating. It also requires being given or commandeering resources somehow. By the way, this is a little bit of a problem for the United States. I mean, we are behind China by quite a bit in robotics and related things, right? So I don't know what happens if we have the brainier, smarter AIs. It's, by the way, this weird reversal of the stereotypes about American and Chinese students, that China has the brawn, right? That they are the ones that are really good at robotics. They're very good at manufacturing and machinery, and a lot of their factories are already. So what if we have the brains and they have the brawn, so to speak, right? And they have maybe a more authoritarian but functional infrastructure. So I don't know what happens then, right? But the ability of AI is to commandeer resources to control the physical world, to me, seems far-fetched on these timelines, in part because of politics, right? I mean, the fact that it takes so long to build a new building in the U.S. or a new subway station or a new highway, and the fact that our politics is kind of sclerotic, right? Look, I mean, I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but if you read the book I recommended last week, Fight, I mean, we basically did not have a fully competent president for the last 2 years, and I would argue that we don't have one for the next 4 years, right? So all these advanced kind of things that we have to plan for, who's doing that fucking planning? Our government's kind of dysfunctional, and maybe that means we just lose to China, right? Maybe that means we lose to China. At least we'll have nice cars, I guess.
Well, one of the, I think that your point about kind of the growth trajectories not necessarily being reliable is a very valid one. I mean, the Japan example is great. Malthusian population growth is another big one, right? We thought that population, would explode, and instead we're actually seeing population decline. So the world does change. The thing that I think they rely on is that the AIs are capable of designing just this incredible technology much more quickly, so that our building process and all of that gets sped up 100-fold from what it is right now. But it still, at least at this point, needs humans to implement it, right? And needs all of these different workers. And so, I think there are some assumptions built into here that I hope, I hope that that timeline isn't feasible. And I do think that there are things that are holding us back. All the same, I think it's interesting. One of the reasons I like this report is that it forces you to think about these things, right? And try to game out some of these worst case scenarios to try to prevent them, which I think is always an important thought exercise. I do want to go back to kind of their good scenario, which just, so bad scenario is, we're all wiped out by, by chemical warfare that the AIs release on us. Good scenario is that, everyone gets a universal basic income and AI does everything and no one has to do anything and we can just live, happily with
play poker, Maria.
Play poker, yeah. And that just, as you suggested, that seems actually like a very dystopian scenario where people can become much more easy to brainwash, control, et cetera, and are just not like, it's like a dumbing down, right? Where we're not challenged to produce good art, to kind of advance in any sort of way. Just, to me, it does not seem like a very meaningful way of life.
Well, I mean, the question is, there's another, if you read AI 2027, which I highly recommend that you read.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's also another post by a pseudonymous, how do you say pseudonymous?
Yeah, pseudonymous. You're absolutely right.
Poster called L. Rudolph L. So search for LRUDOLF, who wrote something called A History of the Future 2025 to 2040, which is very detailed, but goes through kind of like what this looks like at like more of a human level, how society evolves, how the economy evolves, how work evolves, right? And like very detailed, just like AI 2027 is, but kind of focuses on the parts of AI 27 that I think it kind of deliberately ignores. Maybe you can call them mild blind spots or whatever, right? But that's interesting because that kind of thinks about like what types of jobs are there in the future. There are probably lots of lawyers, actually, right? Because the law is very sluggish to change, especially in a constitutional system where there are lots of veto points, right? Probably high-end service sector. You go to a restaurant because a lot of people are rich now, right? And you're flattered by the attractive young server and things like that. So it's kind of highly kind of like catered and curated experiences. I guess I have some faith in humanity's ability to fight back, quote unquote, against like two scenarios that it might not really like either one. You know what I mean? And like the scenario where like AI is producing like 10% GDP growth or whatever, right? I mean, it's great if you own stocks that are exposed to AI and tech companies, probably, right? But it's also making that money on the backs of mass job displacement. And like, economists are confident in the long run that human beings find productive things to do and mass unemployment has been predicted many times and never really occurred, right? But it's not occurring this fast where they think the world ends in 6 years or whatever they're predicting, or we have utopia in 6 years. And like, just the ability of like human society to like deal with that change at these time scales leads to like more chaos than I think they're more predicting. But I think also, and I told them this too, right? I think also leads to more constraints, right? That you hit bottlenecks. If you have 5 things you have to do, right? And you have the world's fastest computer, et cetera, but there's like a power outage in your neighborhood, right? And that's a bottleneck, right? Maybe there are ways around it. You can like go to Home Depot and buy a generator, or you know what I mean? But the point is that like you're often defined by like the slowest link, and politics are sometimes the slowest link, but also by I think the report maybe understates, and I think kind of in general the AI safety community like maybe understates the ability of like human beings to kind of cause harm to other human beings with AI, right? That concern kind of gets brushed off as like too pedestrian or like
I was going to say too pedestrian.
But yeah,
the exact word I was thinking of. I think that's a great place to end it because yes, we do need to be concerned about all of these things about AI, but like that phrase I think is very crucial. Like, do not underestimate the ability of humans to cause harm to other humans. And I think that's it's not a very pleasant place to end, but I think it's a really important place to end. And I think that's a very valid kind of way of reflecting on this, Nate.
Or to trust AIs too much, right? I generally think that concern is like somewhat misplaced, but if we're handing over critical systems to AI, right? It can cause problems if it's very smart and deceives us and doesn't like us very much. It can also cause problems if it has hallucinations, bugs in critical areas where it isn't as robust and hasn't really been tested yet, that are outside of its domain.
Yeah.
Or there could be espionage. Anyway, we will have plenty of time, although maybe only 7 more years actually, to like explore explore these scenarios.
Yes, and in 7 years we'll be like, welcome back to the final episode of Risky Business, because the prediction is we're all going to be dead tomorrow.
Yeah.
But yeah, this was I think an interesting exercise, and I think my P-Doom has slightly gone up as a result of reading this. But I also remain optimistic that that humans can do good as well as harm.
Yeah, my interest in learning Chinese has increased as a result of recent developments, I'd say, Maria.
All right, yeah, Nate, let's do some language immersion. I'm with you.
I'll talk to you soon.